Some of you may not have seen last week's episode. Team YouTube completely delisted my review of Schindler's List from everyone's subscription feed and from search, basically making it impossible to find without a direct link. They are actually suppressing a history of the Holocaust. Considering this episode is getting demonetized too, that'll be the third video in a row that's suppressed. I've got a whole thing coming out next week on YouTube's malfeasance. But before then, please consider donating to my Patreon or buying some merch to support the channel. On with the show. Hey, Cypher here. Given what happened in the Capitol building recently, I think we need to find some kind of precedent. I've seen people on social media with all kinds of takes. Old media does not know how to process what happened. On Twitter, and later on Twitch that day, even I had trouble with coming up with anything that was something in US history that was similar. It was a watershed moment, the kind that only comes along once in a generation, of the type that always has the nation viewing in absolute shock and horror. Perhaps the most salient tweet I made that day was that this was kind of akin to 9/11, the Challenger disaster, JFK's assassination, or Pearl Harbor. Not in terms of casualties or whatever, but because of its poignance. For the last 4 years, the tyranny of the Trump administration has reigned. 2020 really brought out that tyranny further and further, and yet, every time I've mentioned Trump did something indefensible, I've had people in the comments section rushing to defend him, most of the time revealing their bigotry along the way. Do you think there's no reason why I've been increasingly going after bigots? A reminder to everyone, since somebody wants to be in the picture, bigots get banned by decree of King Richard I. As I've seen reiterated in recent weeks, history doesn't repeat itself. Historians just keep having to repeat ourselves because people won't fucking listen. The siege of our Capitol building during the certification of an election is the result of this steady buildup of conspiracism from the Trump administration. He denied the results of the 2016 election, lying about illegal immigrants and dead people voting. Yet somehow, people just expected him to improve once assuming the presidency. He did not. Conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory emanated from the Oval Office and filled our nation to the brim with bigotry. As soon as he lost the popular vote again, and the Electoral College this time, we ignored his conspiracism for months as it grew like a malignant tumor right in the heart of our republic. And then on the morning of January 6th, when he said, "Fight for me,"
and we fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
His cult of personality did exactly that. People literally erected gallows, stormed the Senate chambers with cuffs and weapons, all while calling to hang Trump's closest ally, Mike Pence. Hang Mike Pence! Hang Mike Pence! Hang Mike Pence! Hang Mike Pence! Because he finally broke and refused to go along with destroying our democratic process set forth by the Founding Fathers. The disgust I have for those who claim to be patriots and perpetrate these acts in the name of an oafish tyrant who's too much of a sore loser to yield with grace like every president since Andrew Johnson is beyond my capacity to endure. And yet, the fact is, we've had worse. The problem is, we haven't in anybody's lifetime. No one remembers an angry mob breaking the presidential residence's windows of George Washington as they burnt effigies of John Jay outside. No one remembers Andrew Jackson's presidential inauguration party, which got so out of hand, Jackson had to sneak out the White House's windows in disgrace. No one remembers the year 1919, which made 2020's craziness pale in comparison. This is an American past well outside of living memory. Sure, we've seen the bloodiest war in history only 80 years ago. We've seen a crime wave that magnified murder rates from the mid-1960s to early 1990s. We've seen ghetto riots that took hundreds of lives over the course of the last half-century. But none of that compares to what the US was like before World War II. The past is a foreign country, and it is the job of the historian to yell from the halls of their institutions, pleading with the United States to not repeat those same mistakes. I hope that we can see the dark path that we've been on since the 1980s, which led to this travesty, but I fear that we're going to pretend that a return to normalcy, as in being like the Obama years, will somehow fix the deep rupture neoliberalism brought and Trump laid bare. By the way, I'm still working on a series about the polarization of this country. I'll cover the party switch, culture wars, neoliberalism, and maybe even how the very platform this is on has much to blame for our current crisis. Soon, I will also remake the 1920 versus 2020 episode. For while much of what I said there holds up, predictions are always bound to fail. And I've already made videos about race riots and police brutality. But today, I thought I'd talk about just a few times we've had it worse, and give a bit of a historian's perspective on those moments. Our republic was birthed through insurrection. The battles of Lexington and Concord were anything if not an insurrection. Quickly, the rebels organized into fighting forces, and a year later even proclaimed a revolutionary split with Britain. But they were insurgents until they won recognition from France and eventually their former colonial overlord, Britain. A revolution is only a rebellion until it succeeds. Before the Revolutionary War finished, there were numerous mutinies within the ranks of the Continental Army and militias. They were angry about not being paid correctly, since taxes were inadequate during the Revolution. One of these mutinies, in 1781, even led a successful negotiation with the mutineers, while another that year led to several executions. These were risky mutinies. At one point in 1783, Congress even fled from the marauding soldiers, since Pennsylvania was unwilling to stop the insurrection. This is the reason why we even have a federal enclave of Washington, D.C., so that Congress should not be subject to a state's whim on putting down an insurrection. Of course, that requires the executive authority, as in the president, to not incite a riot and then bid them go home with apparent forgiveness.
So go home. We love you. You're very special.
In that same video, he even continued his conspiracism about the election, which caused the insurrection in the first place.
We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election.
Why the fuck you lying? Why?
You suck!
You're a loser.
Back to the revolution, there was much violence in the backwoods, with regulators performing their own vigilante justice, often fighting mini-guerrilla wars against loyalists. Heck, one even declared his own state in 1799, but vigilantism and filibusters are not the topics here. But when the revolution was over, the newly reformed Confederate Congress had the same problem. Veterans wanted their pensions, but flaws in the Constitution meant that there was insufficient tax revenue, despite the fact that their state was aggressively taxing them. A group of vets, led by Daniel Shays, raised hell in Massachusetts by marching on armories and courthouses. They managed to shut down a good chunk of the state, even plotting to overthrow the government altogether. General Lincoln came out of retirement and quelled the insurrection with a quick march throughout the state. But sporadic revolts plagued the state for another few months. Shays' Rebellion, along with many other structural flaws in the Articles of Confederation, led to the creation of a federal constitution, which we still have today. Despite Shays' Rebellion and the various continental mutinies failing and ruining their movements, the new federal government could finally answer the problems, but insurrections would continue to plague the early republic. A tax on distilled grain was one of the earliest direct taxes levied by Congress in 1791. It put an extra tax burden on frontier farms who made whiskey out of their wheat and rye for ease of transport toward the coast. In the backwoods of Pennsylvania, farmers began to resist tax collectors, even burning their homes and silos or anyone's stuff that cooperated with their efforts. They got to the point of tarring and feathering one. Eventually, attorneys issued writs to begin arrests, but the rebels began a small battle to stop the marshal, who was coming out to do the arrests. Around 7,000 rebels gathered to march on Pittsburgh, but citizens there gave up the inspectors, and the federal government even tried to meet with the rebels and negotiate, though to no avail. With all of this going on, President Washington personally led an army detachment to put down the insurrection. It's the only time in history that a president led an army in the field. They all dispersed before the army could even arrive. They utterly failed, as almost all subsequent insurrections would, which set the tone for much to come. Now, it would be impossible to list all the various rebellions throughout US history, so I'm going to focus on the real standout situations. If you really want to dig into the incidents, there's an incomplete list on Wikipedia, which lists civil unrest, rebellions, race riots, and also I made a list of American conflicts, all of which are linked below. This is so commonplace in US history, in fact, that it seems rather foolhardy to go into specific incidents. There's been all kinds of civil unrest, from nativist attacks, slave uprisings, tax revolts, attempted coups at local levels, and so many other types. Violence is pervasive in US history, which is why I study it professionally. These were so commonplace that Congress passed the Insurrection Act in 1807, allowing the president to declare an insurrection and activate militias to quell it. Since the enactment, it has been used at least 23 times, but to show its flexibility, Jefferson used it immediately to deploy troops against people resisting an embargo of Britain. These guys were just smuggling goods across the border into Canada. So, the very term insurrection is fraught with definition problems. The 1807 law does not give a definition. The federal government is the ultimate arbiter of legal use of force, as enshrined by the Constitution's preamble stating, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." Violating these core principles is what ultimately makes an insurrection. But here, I'm mostly interested in times when a mob, or rebellion, tried to actually overthrow a duly elected government, like the Capitol insurrection just recently. The only time that's happened with Congress before was the Pennsylvania Mutiny that made DC a necessity in the first place, but at the local level, this was actually pretty commonplace. Perhaps the most obvious illusion was the possibility of completely losing the War of 1812 and therefore becoming British subjects once again. It was the last time before 2021 that the Capitol was looted. Back then, they burnt it and much of DC altogether before scurrying away from a miraculous maelstrom. But perhaps more importantly, let's not forget America's original sin, our colonization of indigenous lands. Many tribes did not yield to this onslaught of foreign settlers so easily. As soon as the new Constitution was enshrined, the US had to fight a series of battles in the Northwest to gain control. In the late 1780s, there'd been a series of raids and counter-raids over treaty borders. Various tribes throughout the Ohio Valley formed a great confederacy to hold their territory by force, but they also failed to stop individual raiders. In 1790, the federal government stepped in to send a small army. The first campaign came back defeated, so a larger force of around 1,000 soldiers under General St. Clair was sent out to defeat the Northwest Confederacy. They were defeated by an equally sized force of confederated nations, making for one of the worst defeats in American history. The U.S. Army reorganized and eventually defeated the Northwest Confederacy, but not without sowing the seeds of the War of 1812, for Tecumseh would attempt to form another confederacy and even thought he could turn the tide of settler colonialism back to the sea. In effect, this was the U.S. engaging in conquest, but it began out of raiding and counter-raiding for control of territory, which could be considered as insurrection to take over governance. But there's a really good example of the other way around, just a little further westward. German immigrants had settled a bunch of land in Minnesota before the Civil War. In 1851, the U.S. ceded the territory from the Dakota Sioux in exchange for annuity payments and supplies. Because of the corrupt arrangements with traders to provide these supplies, the U.S. failed to make them often. Beginning in the late 1859, it basically ended. With the onset of the Civil War a couple years later, the situation became more and more neglected, much to the detriment of those settlers. In 1862, a Dakota hunting party killed 5 settlers for a single egg. Probably sensing the weakness of the federal government, who was engaged in a war against itself, the tribe decided to act preemptively. They broke out over the course of a week, slaughtering as many settlers in the region as they could. They killed between 500 and 800 of them, which is the largest massacre of civilians in U.S. history until 9/11, and it was to overtake the local government in Minnesota. Of course, the U.S. Army deployed enough troops to quash the insurrection, displace the entire tribe, and send them to a brutal concentration camp on Pike Island before removing the tribe to its present location. 303 Dakotans were sentenced to death, but Lincoln either pardoned or commuted most of their sentences, leaving 38 to be hanged in the U.S.'s largest mass execution after the one in Mexico of the San Patricios. Now, how are these events termed insurrection? Is more because the U.S. government's inability to prevent them. The preamble specifically states that the federal constitution was established to provide for the common defense, and these are pretty obvious failures of that. Along the same vein, the U.S. government can fail to promote the general welfare. These especially occur when we've asserted colonial hegemony over people. Much akin to what happened with Dakotans in 1862, this is when our imperialism was challenged, threatening the very government that ruled over people. Throughout the Indian Wars, this was kinda the case, but few of those ever really rose to the level of challenging a government, such as the Northwest Confederacy or the Dakotan War. But after the U.S. defeated Spain in 1898, a new range of colonies came into her possession. Almost immediately, those colonies rebelled. The U.S. had promised Philippine rebels their own independent republic in exchange for their help in defeating the Spanish. But the treaty between Spain and America gave the Philippines as a colony to the U.S. Emilio Aguinaldo had already proclaimed the creation of a republic, so this was a double cross. Enraged by the U.S. refusal to promote the general welfare, he declared war and initiated a series of surprise attacks and massacres of U.S. troops in the colony. This led to one of the nastiest wars the U.S. has ever fought, where we resorted to torture and genocide in order to pacify the insurrection. I spoke about this in a previous episode on the topic, so let's talk about a more recent one that also came from one of these newly acquired territories. Puerto Rico is still an American territory acquired by the Spanish-American War. Although they did just have a vote in 2020 to become a state, we'll see if that goes anywhere. It was essentially a colony, though it went through a series of steps toward territorial status. For instance, in 1917, a certain president gave them full rights as American citizens in order to recruit them for the World War, including imposing a draft. This actually somewhat suppressed the strong independence movement there, which was probably part of the intended effect. In a way, Woodrow Wilson was trying to assimilate them. No matter, as with most of his Latin American ventures, it failed and Puerto Rican nationalism arose again quickly thereafter, with the founding of a political party only a year after he left office. In 1935, police shot up a car full of nationalists at the University of Puerto Rico, killing 4. A couple years later, during a march protesting the imprisonment of the Nationalist Party's leader, Pedro Albizu Campos, cops shot into the crowd, killing 19 and wounding many more. One of the victims even scrawled in his own blood on a wall, this, which translates to, "Long live the Republic, down with the assassins." Though Franklin Delano Roosevelt fired the governor for this, it remained a stigma for much agitation to come. Instead, nationalists turned to assassination, killing a few colonial officials. The entire bureaucracy heavily suppressed nationalism in response. They even banned the use of the Puerto Rican flag in 1948, which was designed from the Cuban flag, which was itself from an American filibuster. In a sense, the US banned its own flag variation, demanding the 48-star variant be used instead. All of this boiled over in 1950, when the US government granted Commonwealth status to Puerto Rico, at least if they chose so. Nationalists wanted an independence vote, but they could only vote for either a new constitution or remaining an American colony. So they staged a series of revolts throughout the early 50s. Around 30 people died in the various incidents and uprisings. Most of these were easily put down, and in fact Puerto Ricans voted for the new constitution in 1952. Before that, though, what really destroyed any chance of nationalists being taken seriously was an assassination attempt on President Truman in 1950. He was living at the guest residence while the White House was being renovated, and the assassins assaulted the place because it was less secure. The guards halted the gunmen, killing one of them. These guards were injured, and one succumbed to his wounds. A few years later, they even shot from the gallery into the House of Representatives, wounding 5 congressmen. Interestingly enough, besides this and the January 6th incident just recently, the only other time I can find of a firearm being discharged inside the halls of Congress was in 1998, when a crazy man killed 2 cops in an abortive mass shooting. Though there have been 3 previous bombs that detonated as well. So there is, in fact, a lot of precedence for terror attacks inside the Capitol. But these are attacks, not insurrections, save for the Puerto Rican one, since it was part of an insurrection. In terms of Puerto Rico, given the US had already granted independence to the Philippines the year after World War II, the fact that independence wasn't an option on the ballot led to these insurrections. Considering the revolution that founded the United States and the preamble's requirement of promoting general welfare, this is quite the oversight. Even though subsequent votes on independence have all received little support, that would not begin until 1967, and the last one was in 2017 with barely even a quarter of the voting public on the island showing up. Perhaps the insurrection itself turned opinions away from independence, but then again, that did not happen with the Philippines earlier. But the war in the Philippines was an organized republic as opposed to a vocal minority in Puerto Rico. Independence is one thing for a colonial possession, but it's quite different for a state. Once brought into the Union, it is bound in perpetuity. The Articles of Confederation unflinchingly declared the Union to be perpetual no less than 6 times. Creating further territories according to the Land Ordinance, and eventually becoming states, they shall forever remain part of the Confederacy of the United States of America. This law was re-upped in 1789 under the Federal Constitution. And that federal constitution clearly states that it was made in order to form a more perfect union. So secession is very clearly proscribed, yet that doesn't mean people haven't attempted it.
And let our motto ever be for union and for liberty. Right away, come away, right away, come away.
Obviously, the Civil War was one such case. Southern states declared secession, forming a confederacy specifically to protect their institution of slavery. Lost causers will pretend that it was purely for freedom or what have you. But in reality, the Confederacy very clearly stated in numerous declarations and speeches that they left out of fear for losing their slaves. Funny thing is, there was very little the federal government could have done to end slavery before they rebelled. The debate was more over slavery's expansion into the West, but as what happens so often in US history, people took an implication to mean a great deal more. Just like you'll hear folks today talking about, "They're going to come and take your guns." Replace the word guns with slaves and you'll get the attitude that this debate entailed. The government doesn't have an ability to come and take your guns or to come and take your slaves, but that was the fear. It was basically a conspiracy theory. When the South rebelled, they attacked US garrisons, stole armaments, and eventually attacked Fort Sumter. President Lincoln declared an insurrection a couple days later, so the entire Civil War was an insurrection. Funny how no Confederate invasion got close to Washington, D.C. though. Yet the recent siege managed to get an imaginary version of their flag inside the Capitol building during the Bedlam. There's been many sedition movements in the US, and some that were very violent. For instance, there was the King of Beaver Island. After a lynch mob shot the founder of Mormonism and his brother in 1844, there was a succession crisis within the church. One leader named James Strang formed his own Church of Latter-day Saints and led 12,000 followers to Beaver Island in Lake Michigan. He declared himself a king in 1850 and also began plural marriage, aka polygamy. Michiganders arrested him in 1856 and savagely pistol-whipped the would-be king, who would die due to the injury 3 weeks later. Before that, drunken Gentiles attacked the island to expel the Mormons. Though only Strang died, that was only because no one fought back and more lives weren't lost. Essentially, this was an insurrection to stop secession. Even last year, there was the creation of the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle. Black Lives Matter activists managed to protest the police in the area away peacefully, despite Seattle PD using dispersion ordinance, something Seattle had pioneered a couple decades earlier. Many activists claimed it was not for secession.
We're not fighting the military. We're not trying to secede from the United States. If we do, then we're losing all the progress we're actually trying to make.
So Seattle allowed Chaz's existence so long as they could maintain peace on their own. It was somewhat like the Occupy movement of 2011, though with a far more coherent purpose. The Occupy movement was simply opposed to disproportionate corporate interest in the global economy during the Great Recession, while Chaz strove to raise awareness of police brutality and campaigned for a 50% defunding. For 2 months, the Chaz was a self-operated no-police area of just a few blocks in Seattle. After 4 shootings in and around the occupation, Seattle cleared it and re-established the police precinct. But Seattle has defunded their police by 20% for 2021. Still, this essentially went nowhere, much like another occupation in 1973 at Wounded Knee. The last of the many occupations during the American Indian movement ended in a standoff. They first rioted when only a few Oglala Sioux were allowed into a meeting to resolve the protests, despite a blizzard raging over the people left outside. They destroyed much and removed to occupy the small hamlet of a historically significant location of the Wounded Knee Massacre. The American Indian Movement, AIM, shot first and hit 2 marshals. 2 months of the siege, and AIM surrendered after 2 of them were killed and many wounded, leading to a bunch of them serving prison sentences for the shootout. This small insurrection was not a secession movement, but it illustrates how occupation movements sometimes share the same anatomy. For the Wounded Knee incident was meant to challenge local governance within the Pine Ridge Reservation and raise awareness for American Indian issues. Trying to take over local governance has been a major form of insurrection for much of American history, perhaps best signified by county and range wars, where people try to dominate a county or range through violence, often as a result of a feud. These were common throughout the western frontier. Johnson, Colfax, Mason, and the most famous of them all, Lincoln County, all were county wars. I've already made a video about the Lincoln County War, so go check that out. After all, that's where Billy the Kid really made a name for himself. And it was the only one of these that actually had the Insurrection Act used to squash it. Then there's range wars where people fight over control of ranges. These break the peace from within, and the most powerful people in the given area fight for control, which is an explicit violation of the Constitution's call to ensure domestic tranquility. So let's look at one that engulfed multiple counties and was perhaps the bloodiest feud in American history. Most people know of it as the Pleasant Valley War, though it was throughout the Tonto Basin and along the Magallanes Rim in Arizona. The area had already been at war for some time against Apaches. It was a brutal fight, instilling a violent code of ethics among the various ranchers coming to take over the newly conquered land. As disputes inevitably arose over maverick cattle, property borders, sheep herders, and rustlers, violent clashes over honor became normal by the early 1880s. It initially involved smaller ranchers attacking larger ones, but the smaller Tewksbury and Graham factions ended up fighting among themselves. They fortified the ranges and brought gunmen from Texas. After a decade of periodic raiding, lynching, and shootouts, the last of the Grahams was assassinated in 1892, making the Tewksburys the final victors with around 50 corpses to celebrate over, just in time for more population to dwarf that number. Feuds ran wild everywhere in the country. Range and county wars were one way that manifested, but that was abstract power. Sometimes they were aligned by political parties, but most of the time they were merely personal. The election riot is quite a different story, and they challenge the last part of the preamble that can even be challenged. Securing the blessings of liberty and our posterity is what enshrines the ability to vote, to be heard, to participate in our democracy, and nothing interrupts that more than an election riot. For instance, here in New Mexico, there was an election riot in 1871 down in Mesilla. It took 9 lives and was literally a shootout between Democrats and Republicans, killing one of the candidates. The shooting continued for a few hours, though most of the deaths occurred in the first few minutes. The cavalry arrived within 6 hours, but everything was done then. I'm supposed to have an article on this published sometime soon, so I won't go too much more into detail, because it talks about the Santa Fe ring, the Gadsden Purchase, and all kinds of other stuff. But this was part of a huge trend in that decade as Democrats attempted to take back the South from Republicans. At this point, Democrats were the conservative party. In fact, Republicans were so radical that a split formed in 1872 called the Liberal Republicans because they wanted more moderation. Quite the opposite of the parties today. Currently, you're more likely to see Republicans spouting off lost cause BS, and the Klan is very much opposed to the Democrats.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
My idea is simply this. America was built by and for the white Christian people of this nation.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had
America great again.
But at this point, the roles were reversed, and far, far worse. The Klan was essentially a paramilitary arm of the Redeemer Democrats, who wanted to redeem the South back to its white supremacist antebellum glory days. In 1871, Republicans cracked down on the Klan in probably the best thing the Grant administration ever did, but other racist groups arose in their stead. They rained terror down upon those who voted Republican in the South, which were white liberals and blacks as a whole. Through voter intimidation and ballot stuffing, they managed to create a solidly Democrat South by the 1880s. And eventually, they used that power to disenfranchise black people from the vote, which they had already been terrorizing away, instituting Jim Crow laws in the 1890s and early 1900s. But in the 1870s, that was still contested. Election riots attempted to overturn or menace election results throughout the decade, and these were commonplace throughout the South. In 1870, there was the Barber-Mizell feud in Florida, which killed 41. Though it wasn't directly between Republicans and Democrats, it was about taxes being paid to a federal government ex-Confederates didn't want to support. Then the first actual one was a series of fights over putting down the KKK in North Carolina that same year, leading to 28 casualties. Then there was a race riot in 1871 Mississippi, killing over 30 people who were mostly black. In 1874, there was the Brooks-Baxter War, fought over Republican control of Arkansas. They had several attempted seizures of government by force and dozens dead in the process. Baxter maintained his governorship, but he had to do so by suppressing the insurrection with brute force, which made him lose the election to a Democrat later that year. In South Carolina throughout 1876, white supremacists called the Red Shirts terrorized black people, killing around 100. Many counties had black majorities, yet suspiciously voted Democrat, sometimes with more voters than existed on the rolls. The worst began in 1872. Democrats refused to accept the election results of the gubernatorial race for Louisiana. Disputes continued for years, and a group of black people fortified a courthouse in Colfax to maintain control of the county and protect the black Republicans there. Some eventually raided the Democrat leader's house, leading to a shootout, and the white supremacists became extremely outraged. So they countered by massacring people at the courthouse, killing around 100 black people. The cases for this went all the way to the Supreme Court, who shrugged off the 14th Amendment protections to individuals and ruled that the Anti-KKK Enforcement Act was unconstitutional. The White League, which was a more covert group after the KKK had been defeated, could prey upon black Republicans as much as they pleased because the Democrat governor was still not yielding despite the fact that he had definitely lost the vote. A year later, the White League struck at government buildings in New Orleans and an armory. They were around 5,000 strong, so ex-Confederate General Longstreet organized a militia and the police to fight these terrorists back after they'd controlled the capital for 3 days. More than 30 people died. Even Longstreet was wounded during the Battle of Liberty Place. So the Democrat gubernatorial candidate finally conceded after the bloodshed in his name. Remind you of anyone?
We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
Right-wing politicians denying election results can easily lead to white supremacist terrorism. Conspiracy theories inherently inspire violence. With the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Redeemer Democrats instituted Jim Crow to make sure blacks could not win an election again. But there were some holdouts. In Wilmington, North Carolina, black people still held significant office by 1898. A mob of 2,000 white supremacists attacked the local government, destroying black businesses and massacring black people throughout the town, killing anywhere between 60 and 300 people. They installed a Redeemer Democrat government. 4 of the organizers became governors of North Carolina. 2 became senators, and 1 was even appointed Secretary of the Navy by none other than Woodrow Wilson, whose appointees were almost always white supremacists. Wilson! This is the sole successful coup d'etat in American history. Luckily, that is not what happened in the Capitol on January 6th. They tried to disrupt the certification of a presidential vote at the whim of Trump's conspiracism, but failed to do so like so many insurrections before. But it is really telling that law enforcement was caught so unprepared. Some even guffawed with the insurrectionaries. We have seen the Insurrection Act used on Washington, D.C. itself, but against a peaceful protest. I spoke of the 1932 Bonus Army in my Veterans History video, which had President Hoover ordering troops to violently disperse World War I vets on the National Mall, which killed 2 of them in the process. It was a huge propaganda win for the Roosevelt campaign, who used this indignity to win the election. The Bonus Army hadn't violated the preamble of the Constitution. What happened at the Capitol just recently did. It sought to disrupt the Union, justice, domestic tranquility, the general welfare, and most importantly, the blessings of liberty. They challenged everything our Constitution was established for, all while declaring their so-called patriotism. As we've seen throughout this history, insurrection can come in all shapes and sizes. I haven't even talked about how the Insurrection Act was used throughout the 20th century to stop racial violence. These examples have been of a very specific kind, the ones that try to overthrow a government and ultimately violate the preamble of our Constitution. The closest a president has come to engaging in an insurrection was Woodrow Wilson's tacit endorsement of the Wilmington coup, well after the fact. We have had worse times, just not within living memory.